Hi everyone and welcome back. We are looking this week at corruption. This is our last session on financial crime. It's quite an interesting topic, particularly because there's always a lot happening in Hong Kong in the field of corruption, and there are quite a lot of ongoing investigations around corruption. There are lots of allegations of corruption flying around in politics and in cases involving not only civil servants, people who work for the government, but all sorts of professional people in Hong Kong get accused of corruption. If you have read the documents for today, you already know that, right? Because the things like document number 3 talks about the corruption case for the concrete tests done at the Hong Kong Zhuhai Macau Bridge, which is something you probably have heard about. And it's a very recent case in which someone pleaded guilty recently. Things are going really, really fast with this case. And so obviously there's a lot of media attention on that. If you have read the history of the ICAC document 4, and if you have looked at some of the early cases and what the ICAC puts on its website, you can see that it has a rich history of going after corrupt individuals at every level, right? So what we have in document 2 is simply the ICAC's website, what they call the landmark cases, early classic cases in government departments, the public sector, finance, insurance, listed companies, cases that concern livelihood, right? Things like the food, the grocery sector, cases of election corruption, of course, and then cross-boundary corruption, which is obviously international cases that involve payment of bribes, for instance, across the border or by someone abroad. So for today, what we're going to do, you know the format now, right? So it's not particularly different from what we usually do. We started with what are we talking about? What is corruption? Why should we care about it? And then we move on to enforcement. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time today on the ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, which is the watchdog, the regulator, the independent agency that's in charge of fighting corruption in Hong Kong. And then in the end, we have a case study, which is our document number 11, the case that you must have read before we start this session. Okay, the difference today is that this is a purely online session, right? There is no in-class meeting. We are not meeting face-to-face. And the reason is that last Thursday was bank holiday and that we already have a catch-up class to make up for some other classes that we've missed previously, including because of Athletics Day. So what we do today is simply an online video lecture. What does that mean? It means that you better really prepare for it, right? So you read all the documents, the 11 documents for today. Most of them, as usually, are short press articles. You read the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance document 1, with which you are already familiar because we've used that as an example in session 1, session 2 at the beginning of the semester. And then you work with me, so when I indicate that we have a case study and exercise, to pause the recording, pause the video, and try and answer the questions, then do it, right? Don't be lazy and don't be complacent. Don't think that simply because this is an online video then you don't have to do it. This is our 7th week together, and this is also our last week on financial crime before we move on to other topics, right? So the rest of the semester will be spent talking about subjects that are a little bit more financy and less legally, right? So risk management, we will talk about internal controls and how we use IT in compliance, right? So, but for now, financial crime, our last session for today. Slide number 3, we begin with what is corruption, right? And to answer the question, we need to understand what's a bribe. What is bribery, right? A bribe is a gift of money or any other inducement, we've talked about inducement in class, to convince someone to act in a way which is different from how this person was supposed to act. Right? So you see that it's not especially government related. It doesn't necessarily mean that this person has to be a government official to be corrupt or to be the one paying a bribe or accepting a bribe. Right? It concerns absolutely everyone. But of course, when we talk about corruption, we tend to think a little bit more about government official. Now, in short, what it means is that bribery consists in using money to change the normal course of things, meaning there is a certain way things should be done because the law, because guidelines say it, because practice says it, and then you use money or another gift to change this, right, and to simply obtain a different result, right? So if we move on to then what is corruption, we also need to understand that it's the offering of a bribe, of course, but what else can be a bribe, right? Money, but other things. Can you think of other things that can be offered as bribes? Now you have to think about it for a second. You have to look at the documents for today, and you would see that in some cases, it's not necessarily money, right? People haven't been offered money, or there is no evidence, no proof that they have received bank transfer, a cash payment, and simply in that case, we are looking for what did the person receive as an advantage. And we've talked about that before, right? We've spoken about that in the Donald Tsang case, where the difficulty for the jury and the reason Donald Tsang was acquitted of the charges of corruption against him is because it was difficult to prove, and the jury was not convinced that what he had received was an advantage for the purpose of the POBO. And you remember what Donald Tsang was accused of receiving was a flat in Shenzhen, which obviously is worth millions and millions of dollars, and he accepted renovation services, right? So someone would have allegedly come to his place and redecorated the whole place, which is also the kind of services that are considered luxury, right? To have an interior decorator come to your place and renovate it entirely. When we're talking about a penthouse flat or duplex flats, that costs potentially several millions of dollars as well. But the jury wasn't convinced that that had been offered as an advantage, right? And so try and think of the other things that can be offered as a bribe. Think about, for instance, the topics we've seen last week in the previous session that we did, which was on AML, anti-money laundering. We saw that in some cases people had received trips, travel, free air tickets, handbags, luxury handbags, watches, jewelry. It doesn't necessarily have to be money, right? And so our first exercise for today is on slide number 5. And so it's very important that you pause on slide number 5, read document number 1, POBO, sections 1 to 12, and 4 to 12, sorry, and try and understand what does it prohibit. You must be able by now, having nearly graduated and being ready to enter the life as a professional and the person who has studied law and business, to read an ordinance and to say, well, this is prohibited, this is prohibited, this is prohibited, right? An ordinance generally is a piece of legislation that prohibits something. It makes something illegal, right? It forces you to respect certain rules by creating interdiction, something that you cannot do. Now, POBO section 4 to 12 is not simple, right? It's not particularly intelligible, simple, easy text. It's written by legislators. They want to be clear, they want to be thorough, but because of that, they're not very simple in the way they write. Now, take section 4 to 12 and try and find, for instance, 5 things that are forbidden by the POBO. All right, so you pause the recording here and try and find out what does the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, section 4 to 12, prohibit. All right, so you should play back the recording now and look with me at slide number 6. What you should have found in that case is that it prohibits a government officer from accepting or soliciting an advantage. That's section 3. Offering an advantage to a public servant, for the public servant accepting or soliciting an advantage for doing or not doing something, section 4, including in relation to government contracts, section 5. We're looking at offering or accepting an advantage in exchange for withdrawing from or accepting to withdraw from a government tender, meaning when the government is selling something or buying something, sorry. Section 6, or from a government auction, when there's an auction process, section 7. It prohibits offering an advantage to a public servant or for the public servant accepting this advantage whilst doing business with the civil servants department, section 8. We've spoken about section 8 already. That is what we used in section 1, section 2 at the beginning of the semester as an example on how to draft guidelines. Now, section 9 says that you can't offer an advantage or can't receive an advantage to an agent, or as an agent can't receive an advantage. What does that mean? Well, we will speak about that a little bit. The agent is a concept that you should be familiar with thanks to your study of contract law, of course, and perhaps even company law. But at this stage, remember that it's not just about government officials, and it also concerns normal business relationships in which they are often agents. I put a couple of slides here that are simply to make you kind of think a little bit about the ICAC. There is their mission statement on slide number 7. And slide number 8, it's quite interesting. It's the number of people who work at ICAC. Look at that, 1,300 people. This is absolutely enormous. This is a lot of people. And this is a lot more than many, many agencies of Hong Kong. The SFC, the HKMA have about 800 people each. The Hong Kong Competition Commission has only 50 staff. Right? This is many, many times less than the ICAC. ICAC is one of the biggest regulators in Hong Kong. Their internal organization, section 9, slide number 9, shows you that there are 3 divisions: law, enforcement, prevention, and education. Of course, for the purpose of today, we are mostly interested in law enforcement, right? So they have investigation powers, which we see in slide number 10, and which, of course, you have seen as part of your reading, document number 1, the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, and also the generally the press article, which shows that the ICAC can arrest people, they can grant bail, they have the power to search and seize premises, whether it is personal premises, a house, a flat, or whether it is an office, and they can handle any other offense that they come across when they investigate alleged corruption, right? So if they find bank fraud, then they can start investigating bank fraud if they come across bank fraud during their investigation. It's quite important. And there are, of course, checks and balances, right? What you see in the POBO is that the ICAC needs a warrant for most of its actions. It needs to go to the judge and have probable cause and demonstrate that they have a reasonable cause to suspect that a person has done something. Then they get a warrant, and then only they can start entering premises, arresting someone, right? On slide number 11, I'm going to ask you to think about why do we need a specialist agency to fight corruption? Not why do we need to fight corruption. This is relatively obvious. Not going to go over that. We've talked about that with anti-money laundering. Why do we need to fight money laundering? This is all obvious, right? These are crimes that everyone is suffering about. This is connected to a lot of crimes that we're very, very happy to learn about when we work in law enforcement. We're very happy to catch the people who do that. And it's simply part of the mission of the state to fight criminality. But why do we need a specialist agency, a specialized watchdog, someone who only does that, or almost only does anti-corruption work? Why? What's the reason? So pause the recording and try and list some of the reasons why we need a specialist agency. So you should have thought about a couple of reasons that, of course, are listed on slide number 12 to prevent political interference, right? So to make sure that politicians which have the power to manage the state and give orders to some branches of the government do not have the ability to give orders to the ICAC. The ICAC does not obey the Chief Executive of Hong Kong, does not take orders from the Secretary of Interior or the Secretary of Security. Right? The ICAC is an independent agency, so that prevents political interference. They must be able to investigate the police. Very simply, right? One of the people who we generally suspect of corruption is, of course, the Hong Kong police force, because they are in a position to accept bribes in many, many cases, and they are, of course, often the targets of action by the ICAC. We have studied a couple of cases, including recently the Chief Technology Officer who was arrested for fraud, Chief Technology Officer of the police. Right, so we need to be able to investigate the police, and of course the police can't do that, right? They can't investigate themselves, so we need a specialist agency to investigate the police in corruption cases, right? We need to develop specialized skills, right? Because anti-corruption is very specific, and so it's more efficient, more productive to have an agency that only does that and that transmits the knowledge to the newcomers, the new recruits, the young people just out of university who will learn. They will be at a place where everyone is doing anti-corruption, therefore they will learn and pick up very quickly, and they will most of the time spend their entire career doing anti-corruption work, right? And then it allows you to, as an agency, to do more than just enforcement, right? You can educate the people, you can prevent, as we say in slide number 9, there are other divisions, prevention and education, The Department of Justice, for instance, does not do that, right? They don't have a mission to educate or to prevent crime. We see on slide number 13 that the ICAC received 18% more complaints of corruption, and that is document number 7, article from the Hong Kong Economic Journal. Interesting number, 18% more complaints of corruption in 1 year. So think about what it means, and it's difficult to know what it means. Right? This is the kind of statistic that as an educated person you must stop for a second and think, wait a minute, 18% more complaints of corruption, that might mean a lot of different things. It might mean more corruption, simply. It might mean that there are more cases, right? So that Hong Kong is becoming a more corrupt place. Or it might mean that there is more awareness, right? And that part of the ICAC's mission to educate the people is actually successful, and that more people recognize corruption, think about corruption, and they see something, therefore they say something and give a phone call or send an email to ICAC, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean more corruption. It might just mean that more people are aware of corruption. Slide number 14 is interesting because what I put here is just a couple of headlines, which are actually the documents 8, 9, and 10 of today. What they are about is really the problems at ICAC at the moment. Right? ICAC has been around for nearly 50 years, and it's one of the success stories of regulation and law enforcement in Hong Kong. They have had a lot of success prosecuting people for corruption, but right now ICAC is simply in the middle of a storm and has been the subject of a lot of debates, controversy, and even accusations in Hong Kong. So what we see with document number 8 is that ICAC is accused of not being particularly transparent when it comes to investigating the chief executive of Hong Kong, the former chief executive of Hong Kong, C.Y. Leung. We also see that the ICAC has failed to appoint an operations chief, which is a very important person in the organization, and that has hit staff morale. And staff morale is important because that's how you retain people, that's how people are happier, they do a better job, they want to improve, they want to participate, they are okay to maybe work longer hours, they are more efficient at work, they are simply better at their jobs because they have strong morale. And that comes from the impression that you're doing a good job as an organization. What's happening when the operations chief is not appointed, when there is no new operations chief appointed to replace the one that left, everyone is thinking that there is a problem, that maybe the ICAC is actually the subject of political interference. So read document number 9, which talks about this. Document number 10 is an interesting one. It's an editorial by Alex Lowe. Alex Lowe, who is a columnist for the South China Morning Post, is a relatively conservative person and is generally not a big fan of the Pan-Democrats. He's more a pro-Beijing politician. He's, in this article, talking about ICAC and how they would be instrumentalized by some politicians. So what we see is that politicians from the Pan-Democrats camp have said publicly that our chief executive, the current chief executive, Carrie Lam, was under investigation for the case relating to the construction of the Imperial Palace Museum in Kowloon. At that time, that was not confirmed, and so what Alex Lowe is doing, he's trying to say that people are using the ICAC to score political points, right? So is the ICAC really instrumentalized in this point? That is up to you to make up your mind and kind of decide whether this is something that really comes from the politicians, from the Pan-Democrats, or whether this is simply a pro-Beijing politician kind of claiming that ICAC has been used, that maybe ICAC is simply doing its job, and that people are simply being transparent about it, and some politicians are kind of discussing this in public. Should ICAC's work be secret, or should it be transparent? Should it be open, or should they publicize cases? Should they talk about their ongoing investigations? Right? These are questions that don't necessarily have a simple answer, but you must be able to make up your mind about it and simply decide for yourself whether ICAC is at the moment subject to political pressures or not, and if it is, if it's more than before, if it has changed or evolved. The last part for today is a case study, and case study means read the case. Right? So you're going to make sure that you have read document number 11 for today, which is the Ma Xin-shi case. The Ma Xin-shi case is interesting because the final leg of it only took place a few months ago and was decided in what we have, right? So what we have, the document number 11 for today, is not the full case on which we decided the merits. So one of the questions about the case is, what is the decision about? Second question, who are the main characters of the case? You must be able to read the case. It's not really long, it's not even 10 pages, and you must be able to say this is the main character, this is a kind of secondary person in the case, not very important. These are really the people who are important in this case, right? What is defendant 1, which we always write D1 in cases, what is defendant 1, D1, accused of? Right, so look in the case at what the person is accused of, and how does that relate to what we've done before, right? What is prohibited under the POBO? What are the elements of the offense which the prosecution must prove? This question is interesting. It forces you to go and look inside the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance. What are all the boxes that the ICAC must be able to tick? And one by one, must be able to say, well, this person has done A, B, C, D, and this is the definition of the offense, and that person ticked all the boxes, therefore that person, if he or she doesn't have defense, is guilty of the offense, right? So that's how we reason in criminal law. The reasoning in criminal law is take the definition of the offense, A, B, C, D, and check the facts and check that the person ticks all the boxes. And then if there's no defense, the person is guilty, right? It's a fairly straightforward process. What are the arguments presented by D1? So how did defendant 1 try to defend himself in this case, right? And that's also interesting because you must be able to say whether or not these are good arguments and how many of them are they. So pause the recording here, dive into document number 11, and take the time to properly try and understand what has happened in this case. Please note that this will be very helpful for those of you who have selected maybe a corruption case for your first assignment for this course, because they will force you to really practice the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, not just read it, not just go over it, not just look at slides or listen to an online video lecture like this, but to actually practice it, right? Take the case, take the ordinance, put them next to each other and try and understand what happened, how do judges think, how do compliance people think, how do regulators or lawyers think about applying the law. Right, so you pause at slide number 15 and try and work the case out. All right, so you should have looked at document 11 by now, and you move in with me to document 16, which is the answers. Right, so what we see is that document is about sentencing. This is a sentencing decision, which often is done after the case, of 2 defendants who pleaded guilty of corruption offenses. Defendant 1 is Mr. Ma Xin-shi, who gave his name to the case, sadly for him, and defendant 2 is Mr. Ha, right? Defendant 1, of course, here is the agent, and defendant 2 is, in this case, the customer, right? So it's the person who's hiring an agent. So what is defendant 1 accused of? The answer is section 9(1)(a) of the POBO, being an agent, accepting an advantage. Accepting an advantage as an agent. Section 9(1)(a) of the POBO. This is what defendant 1 is accused of. Defendant 1 was a warrant trader with Deutsche Bank, right? And as a warrant trader was passing trades for his customers. And he gave information to Mr. Ha, the kind of father of a rich family, in exchange for payments. How much? That's actually a lot of money we're talking about, right? So if you have read the case, you will see that the Ha family stands accused of having made about 200 million Hong Kong dollars in profits thanks to the information given to them by defendant 1. Now think about it, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem that the trader would give information to his customers? Well, because they favor this customer compared with others, right? The normal course of business is that they were simply not supposed to give private information. They were not supposed to give confidential information to their customers. They have an obligation to keep certain information secret. So of course that probably violates some sort of rules in the Securities and Futures Ordinance, but the ICAC doesn't care about that. What they care about is Prevention of Bribery Ordinance, and they know they can hit a lot harder. So that trader, defendant 1, Mr. Ma, gave information in a way that probably breaches the rules of trading in Hong Kong. Well, what the ICAC does is they say, I don't care that you gave information. You received an advantage as an agent, and that is corruption. And for that, you go to jail. It's much tougher, much harder than the Securities and Futures Ordinance enforced by the Securities and Futures Commission. Quite interesting to see that ICAC takes a different take on things, even though this could have been prosecuted by the SFC, the Securities and Futures Commission, or by standard prosecutors on the basis that this is simply a trading problem, right? Almost an insider trading issue. Elements of the offense, so you go to the POBO section 9.1a, and if you deconstruct it, one way of doing it, you may have a different version, but you should have found 5 things, right? First of all, that you are an agent, you're someone's agent, and then you solicit or you accept, so you ask or you accept an advantage, number 3. 4, you are induced or rewarded by the advantage for not doing something or for doing something. Right? So in that case, for instance, you received cash payments or luxury goods and you gave information. Right? So that's an exchange, you've been induced or you've been rewarded. And 5, of course, without a lawful excuse. That's for pretty much any single offense crime in the world. You always have the option of an excuse. What arguments were presented by defendant 1 is quite interesting. So what we see that defendant 1 maintained at trial that A, he had not treated defendant 2, Mr. Ma, any more favorably than anyone else. The judge didn't buy that. B, the information which he gave to defendant 2 was not proprietary, and he didn't owe a duty of confidentiality, and that information was publicly available. Again, the judge didn't believe that was the case. And C, there was no loss to Deutsche Bank by reason of the profits made to defendant 2. Well, that's not really part of the offense anyway, right? So even if there's no loss for the bank, you can still be guilty of corruption. Finally, all the payments offered and accepted by defendant 1 and defendant 2, respectively, had an innocent explanation. So every single time there was a payment of $100,000, they would say, oh no, it's because actually I was repaying him for some restaurant bill that he paid. Of course, the court didn't buy that, right? The court didn't buy these arguments. Have a read the case, read the Ma Xin-Shi case with these elements in mind. What is the decision about? What are the main characters of the case? What is he accused of? Elements of the offense, which were the arguments presented by the defense. And then if there's something you don't understand, simply send me an email. It's very important that you are able to understand short cases like this, which directly relate to documents you've seen in class, right? That's it for today. As usually, as you know, this is a professionals course, and we're trying to encourage you to go out there and explore more career options. ICAC's recruitment website. Have you thought of applying to the ICAC? I'm not kidding. Go on their website and look at what they look for, what they offer. And I put a little bonus here. There's a physical fitness test, right? So if you read on document number 17, the description of the physical fitness test, ask yourself, can I do that? Right? Is this something that physically I would be able to do? It's quite interesting. You will also have fitness tests if you go to the police, for instance. But I thought it was quite interesting that they put it on the website and they clearly explain what you must be able to do. And there's a little bit more detail on ICAC's website about the fitness tests. That's all for today. I hope you found it interesting. I always quite like stories of kind of corruption and politics, finance and the law getting all mixed up together. This was our last session on financial crimes before we move on to risk and more accounting related issues. But I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, do let me know. And otherwise, we will meet for our lecture on risk very shortly. Thank you very much. Goodbye.